Morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. Yeah, the title of today's talk is "What is mob grazing? Why would you do it, and how do you do it?" And before I get into that, I'll just give you a little bit of my background so you understand where I'm coming from with this. So my starting point. I set up a business in 2008 as a sort of consultant and estate manager, or 2007, and in 2008 I joined the St Paul's Waldenbury estate. So it was one of my clients. I look after them sort of 70% of my time. I guess I spend up there 80% of my time. We had at the time 70 cows, spring calving and autumn calving, set stocked on about 40 acres. Land was heavily overgrazed. I'll go on to that in a second. They were running out of grass this time of year. We had a very dry year similar to this, and they were running out of grass. There were no worm casts in the soil. Cow pats were just sitting on the surface, not disappearing. Cows weren't performing particularly well. We started feeding silage in September because we'd run out of grass completely. It just seemed the whole system was wrong. And at the same time, I had a few cattle of my own, which were on effectively organic land. They'd never been wormed. They'd never had anything done to them. Their cow pats would disappear within a week. They'd spread out within a week and disappear within a month. There were worm casts. The soil would regrow quite quickly. So straight away had a contrast between the two systems, and I could see something was wrong. So I started mob grazing, and this came about by chance. I just happened to be reading a paper in 2008 or 2009, should I say 2010 even, about managing cattle, and someone mentioned mob grazing, and it just chimed with me, and so I started looking into mob grazing. Moved the estate onto it. Within 3 weeks I'd set up some electric fences and moved the cattle onto a sort of quasi mob grazing system as best I understood it then. Applied for a Nuffield scholarship in 2011, or got awarded it in 2011, and this gave me the opportunity to travel around the world sort of studying mob grazing. So I was lucky enough to go to North America. Started off in the Dakotas in north of the USA, travelled up into Canada, into Saskatchewan, and then right down through America down to Mississippi on my travels. Met a whole range of farmers on the way, everyone from Neil Dennis, who's the chap on the left, who had 1,000 head of cattle just through the summer. He moved them 8 times a day on a mob grazing system. The cattle in the picture behind, that's how they spent their days. They were that tightly packed, but he moved them frequently. So he was looking to move them regularly to keep them onto fresh grazing all the time. The other guys were doing it in a varying degree. The guys with the sunglasses and the shotgun behind them, they farmed buffalo, so they had 1,500 buffalo, or bison as we should properly call them. And again, they were mob grazing the bison. So that was the closest thing to natural mob grazing, if you like, and I'll go into sort of what it is in a minute. My Nuffield scholarship then took me to South America, so I visited Paraguay and Argentina, travelled through Paraguay and Argentina. Again, saw a range of farmers all doing different things with not necessarily mob grazing cattle in Argentina, but combining cattle onto arable rotation. So it's looking at mixing the two farming systems together. So yeah, effectively really good mixed farming. After my Nuffield scholarship, I came back, carried on with the estate. I also set up a small-scale dairy business for a few years, selling raw milk. Hi there. Which started off with 2 cows. This is doing part-time, sort of early in the morning, late at night. Started off with 2 cows, built up to 14 cows. I was selling raw milk and retailing it. Built my own mobile parlour, which was a horse box with a milking machine in. And I was selling milk at between £2 and £3 a litre, compared to 20p or 30p a litre that you'd get conventionally. So it was worth doing it even with a small herd like that. After long discussions with my wife and family, we decided that me working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year wasn't sort of ideal for family life. So I've now moved on to sort of store cattle and contract grazing, which I do in my spare time. And the idea is that I'm busy all through the summer and then sell them in the autumn and have winter off from that part of my job, and I just carry on with the estate in the winter. So it frees up a bit of time for family. So that was the sort of holistic management decision I made on that front. But that's my experience. I'm store grazing cattle, but I'm still mob grazing them. I've put these photographs on to show what effectively a new entrant farmer has to put up with when he's trying to break into the business. So this is the bottom middle picture, and the one on the right, that's my bull on the right, is the type of land I'm offered. So these are old river meadows that are full of weeds, full of thistles, full of hogweed. Not a lot of grass in there, but it's taught me how you can use cattle to manage even the roughest parts of the country. They will live off anything, and it's incredible what they live off. It's also incredible how they improve pasture. So I've been grazing cattle on some river meadows like this over the past 3 or 4 years, and already we're seeing a lot fewer weeds and a lot more grass in the paddock, in inverted commas, in the area. So cattle can be a tool for sculpting the landscape and for improving the local vegetation. So what is mob grazing? Well, the simple definition is it's short duration, high density grazing, and the crucial bit is it's short duration, high density grazing with a long recovery period. So you're putting cattle onto a small area of land for a short period of time, so high numbers of cattle for a short period of time, but then they don't return to that area of land for a long time. And the thinking is trying to emulate nature. And I've got this quote that I came across several years ago now, and I think it captures perfectly what mob grazing is about. So this was written by a guy in the 1880s. He was crossing America, and he came across herds of bison, and he said, he got to one herd, and he said, from the top of Pawnee Rock, I could see 6 to 10 miles in almost every direction. The whole vast space was covered with buffalo, looking at a distance like one compact mass, the visual angle not permitting the ground to be seen. And he went on to say that it took days for this herd to pass him by. They were travelling all the time, but it took days for them to all pass him by. The herds were that huge. And this effectively sums up what we're trying to do with mob grazing. We're trying to emulate what happens in nature. So in nature, because ruminants are herd animals, and because there are predators preying on the herd and patrolling around the herds stay tightly bunched, and they're constantly on the move. And so the grasses, as they've grown up, have evolved to survive under these conditions. So they can survive being grazed really hard, and they can survive being trampled and dung and urine splattering them. But then they've also evolved to get used to a long recovery period before the herds return. So the herds would be gone for a long time, allowing the grass to grow up, to go through its life cycle, to produce seed heads and seeds before the herds returned and did the same again, trashed it down, trampled it into the ground, etc., etc. So it's trying to emulate nature, and this effectively is what mob grazing is doing, as opposed to what we tend to do in the 20th, 21st century, which is something similar to set stocking or short rotational grazing, which effectively is asking the grass plant to try and regrow and continually be eaten off. And so the grass, if you think about a grass plant growing, it will push up shoots, the animal will come and bite it off. It then has to use its root reserves to regrow again. And if it gets bitten off before it's had a chance to replenish those root reserves, third time it tries to grow, it's got less and less reserves until it gets to the point where it can grow no longer. So that's what mob grazing is trying to do. It's trying to emulate nature. And as I say, it's compared to set stocking or rotational grazing. And if we just look at these for a minute. So set stocking, effectively the plant has no recovery period. Continually trying to regrow, as I said, continually getting eaten off. And the problem is that in set stocking, the freshest growth, the newest growth, is the most attractive to the animals. So the animal will always chew the freshest growth. It will prefer the young shoots. And as I say, this weakens the plant, and this is why you will see weeds starting to grow in areas that are set stocked. The plants are actually weakened to the point where they stop growing. I saw an example, I don't know if you saw just down the road, there's a field of horses, and it's full of buttercups and very little grass. Sorry, Toby, is that your land? But it's a prime example of what happens. You put animals in there that will graze hard and graze continually, and before you know it, the grass plant is exhausted, and you start to get weed species and other species encroaching. And this is what nature does. It tries to heal the soil. It will grow whatever is needed to grow. If you overgraze, you'll start to get weeds grasses. An improvement on set stocking obviously is rotational grazing. In this example I'm using a sort of very simple 4 paddock rotational grazing, so they're 4-day rotation, so they're in a paddock for 6 days, 18 days recovery, as opposed to mob grazing, in which situation, on this case, we've got 55 cells. They're only on the paddock for 1 day out of the 55, so effectively the land has got 54 days to recover when it's not being re-eaten before the cattle come back. You'll understand hopefully as I go on that the cells aren't uniform like this. This is only sort of a diagrammatic, and it's important to realise that the cell size, which is the block they're grazing in any one day, will actually vary from day to day. So depending on the time of the year, depending on the amount of grass cover, depending on the growth rates ahead of the cattle or the regrowth rates, will depend on the size of the cell you give it, but the principle is the same. To put it into numbers, if you set stock something, then your grass plant is exposed to grazing for the whole of that season. Every day for the 200-day grazing season, it's exposed to grazing. On a rotational, the example I put up, the 24-day rotation, potentially the grass plant is exposed for 50 days of the season. So it's an improvement, but it's still exposed for a lot of that time, and it's still taking energy out of the plant. On a mob grazing system, the example I gave, it's exposed to grazing for fewer than 4 days in that whole 200 days. So you can see that for 196 days plus, it is regrowing unchallenged effectively. And I think it's important to understand what overgrazing is and why it's critical that you don't do it. So overgrazing isn't caused by too many animals in a field. So you can have, as we saw in Neil Dennis's land in Canada, you can have a huge number of animals. Overgrazing is caused by the animals being on a field for too long. So as long as you don't keep them on there for very long, you won't overgraze the plant. So overgrazing happens when it's bitten off, tries to regrow, and then is bitten off again. And that's what depletes the energy reserves, and it only has a certain amount of energy reserves in its roots. And you go beyond that point and the plant will die. So mob grazing, as I've said, it's high density, it's a short duration, so the cattle are only on there for a short time, and it's a long recovery period. So why would we do mob grazing? What are the benefits of it? Well, the first one, if we go through them all really, we look at these in turn. We can maximise sunlight to capture and improve the energy cycle. So we can improve soil health, so put soil organic matter into the soil. Cattle health is better, and I'll go on to explain why I believe this is true. Mineral, nutrients and carbon recycling is better. We improve the water cycle, and we improve the community dynamics, the species that are present, not only actually in the sward, but also in sort of insect life, bird life, right through the food web. We improve it all. This was a picture, I think this was in Missouri when I visited Missouri. This is of a typical field just before it was grazed. So this is fully mature plants. They've had lots of time to recover. As you can see, lots of seed heads, lots of I think there was sainfoin and lucerne in there. So lots of flowers as well. So that benefited the insects. Just about to be grazed, so huge amounts of leaf area, and obviously that leaf area is able to capture lots of sun. And if you think about what we are as farmers, we are sunlight sellers, and those of you who have heard me speak before will know that this is sort of a key theme of what we do as farming. We are selling sunlight. That is all we're doing. So if you remember the photosynthesis equation from your school days, effectively what a plant does is it takes carbon dioxide out of the air and water out of the ground. It uses sunlight to lock them together to form a glucose molecule and to give off oxygen. So the carbon and the oxygen are combined to form this glucose molecule, and that glucose molecule is the building block of life. That is what we're all dependent on as people, as animals, all our movement. If you think about that energy captured by the carbon molecule, that drives everything we do. So Those of you who've driven here today will have come here with fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels are simply sunlight captured in a carbon molecule, in a glucose molecule, millions of years ago. And what you're doing when you're burning that energy is you're releasing that energy. So you're breaking the bonds of the glucose molecule and releasing energy, and that energy is driving your car. The food that you've eaten today before you came here, that again, your body is breaking it down. It's reversing this process effectively. So you're taking in oxygen, which is the right-hand side, you're combining it with the glucose molecule, or the more complex form of the glucose molecule. You're splitting it up into carbon dioxide, which you're giving out, water and energy, and it's the energy that's driving us. So this is the building block of life, and this is what we do as farmers. We sell sunlight energy, and it's vitally important we remember that. That's a critical sort of part of what farming is. And obviously the glucose molecule combines with other things from the soils and forms proteins and different plant structures, but it's that key building block of life. So we capture and sell energy. And the amount of sun that hits the ground, the amount of sunlight peaks in the summer, in the sort of May, June, July. This time of year, as you know, we've got long days, short nights. So it's important that we have as much leaf area on our plants to capture this sunlight that we can. Hence, if you've got short paddocks, you won't be capturing as much sunlight as if you've got very tall paddocks, tall grasses in your paddocks. So capturing sun is critical. Improving soil health. There's a brilliant photograph. It's quite an old photograph now, but it's been replicated. There's Christine Jones in Australia has replicated this with more modern plants, but this shows it perfectly. And basically what this is showing is the plants on the left were clipped very short every few days, so they were kept very short. Plant on the right wasn't clipped at all, and the ones in the middle were clipped at intermediate lengths. And it demonstrates perfectly that if you allow a plant to grow above ground, it will put the same amount of root down below ground. So within the sort of genetic potential of the individual plant, it will put more root down if you have more shoots on top. Now, that seems like common sense, but it's something we tend to forget or not even know about because we never look underground. We rarely dig a hole and have a look at what's going on. So this again is an essential part to remember. Not only are you putting solar panels above ground, you're allowing the roots to develop, and this is putting organic matter into the soil. Our particular area of the country we're quite heavy clay, so the plants don't necessarily need to go deep looking for water most years. But I am finding that the topsoil generally is slowly getting deeper, and now whether that's because we're building up the topsoil or whether it's because the roots are going down, but it is getting deeper and deeper. So to a degree, I think they will hunt down anyway into the soil. This is the second sort of shock that comes to people who are used to conventionally grazing, is the amount of forage that, in inverted commas, is wasted. The principle of mob grazing is that you're asking the cattle to eat just the best bits of the plant, and that's quite an essential thing to remember, and it's quite an important principle to get your head around. If you ask a conventional farmer about grazing tall forages, very mature pastures, they will say it won't work because the cattle won't perform on it, because they're used to seeing an analysis, say for a silage crop where the crop has been cut 2 weeks too late, and the D value, the feed value of the crop, has actually gone down through the floor. Now this is because when you take a silage crop, you will analyse the whole of the plant. So you're taking the whole of the sample and saying, well, the food value isn't very high. With mob grazing, what you're asking the cattle to do is just eat the best bits of the plant. And if you watch a cow or an animal grazing a mob grazed field, it will come in and it will pick the seed heads off, and it will selectively pick the seed heads, and it will pick the tips of the leaves off. It won't eat the stalks, so it leaves the stemmy stalks and just selectively grazes the best bits. The longer you leave them in the field, the more you're forcing them to eat lower down on the plant. And so you can regulate how much they actually take in, and you can regulate the quality of their nutrition. So for dry cows, you might be forcing them to eat a lot more of the stemmy stuff because you don't want them getting too fat. For young cattle, you might be only asking them to eat the very tops of the plants before you move them on. So you can balance it. But by and large, you don't ask them to eat the woody, highly lignified stems. Instead, you're asking them to trample those onto the surface, because these are what feed the soil biology below ground. So you're looking to create effectively a sort of dense layer of peat. This is Neil Dennis's farm in Saskatchewan, the guy I showed you with the 1,000 cattle. And he was creating a real dense layer of a sort of peat-like soil over a heavy clay. And this was a living zone of insects and worms and arthropods and all kinds of things that were slowly breaking down the organic matter. And when you break down organic matter, you release nutrients, and the released nutrients then feed the soil, so they help with regrowth and help with fertility going on. So this is quite critical. So it's not wasted grass, that's the important message. It's actually feeding things below ground, and it's important to remember to do that. Improved cattle health. I think it's a bit like us. If we just eat one thing all the time, we don't feel very good on it. We like a varied diet, and cattle are exactly the same. And it's why if you turn cattle into any field, if it's got hedges or trees in there, they'll go and browse the hedges, and they'll go and pull the leaves off the trees. I've got a herd of sort of young stock there, dairy heifers. They're in a field with, it's mainly cocksfoot, bit of ryegrass, one or two other things, but there's docks in there as well, quite a few docks. It's an old hay meadow. And the first thing they will eat when they move on to a new strip is the docks. They will go and strip the docks completely bare. They love variety, they love sort of a different diet, and so the more varied number of plants you can get, the more different species you can have in your sward, the better the cattle health. I've got some cattle that I've kept outside. I overwinter them outside all year. Had the group for 3 years now. I've never had the vet out to them. They just seem extremely healthy. Now that could just be luck, and it's only a small group, so it's not really representative. But that's what we find. If you give cattle a hugely varied diet, they just seem more healthy. You're not asking them to eat a very lush ryegrass all the time. Their dung is better. Their coats are better. As I say, you're not asking them to eat the worst part of the plant, so they perform very well. We're just extremely pleased with how they look on a mob graze diet. Improving mineral, nutrient and carbon recycling. This is about sort of recycling stuff and how quickly you get the system going. Now, I talked about the estate where I started 10 years ago, and the dung wasn't disappearing. It just sat there. These are photographs that I've taken of dung pats nowadays on the land, and you can see huge numbers of dung beetles. You can see the one on the left. Within an hour, it can be covered in dung beetles. It's incredible. I moved them onto a new bit of river meadow that hadn't been grazed for a long time, or certainly in a lifetime, and within an hour the pats they'd drawn in the dung beetles, so the dung beetles had flown there and populated the cow pats. And we can see on the right, that's within a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, the dung has almost disappeared. It's got new plants growing through it, new seeds sprouting on it. It's virtually broken back into the soil. So the nutrient recycling, it's about this sort of cycling of dung. It's also about the recycling of the trampled forage. So how quickly can you get this sort of the forage that you've laid on the ground back into the soil? Initially, it might be quite a slow process. If your soils are effectively dead, it can take a long time. There's a guy called Gabe Brown in North Dakota, he's mainly an arable farmer. He has livestock as well. He said initially he was concerned about getting ground cover and covering the soil, because no one likes bare soil, so you've got to get ground cover on top. And he started off putting sort of leafy legumes down so that it would feed the forage, because he found those broke down best. And if you put woody plants on top, they would just sit there for years. He says now that he's actually struggling to keep woody stems on the surface for long. He said within a month, even maize stalks or something really woody is disappearing into the soil because his soil is so active. So you can change the actual biological activity of your soils as well. So it's nutrient recycling. It's getting the vegetation broken down and recycled in a form that's available to the growing plants. Improving the water cycle. It's been proven that the amount of organic matter you have in the soil, a 1% increase in organic matter will increase the soil holding capacity by 200,000 litres. So if you can increase your soil organic matter, you increase the water holding capacity, which is good in obviously a dry year like this, but it's also useful in a wet year. So it allows the soil to actually permeate, or the water to permeate through the soil a lot quicker. So it doesn't pool on top, it doesn't saturate the soil. It actually improves it in both dry and wet years. And this was just a graph I found while I was talking about it, looking into this subject a few years ago, and it's talking about water runoff and infiltration, and compared to the amount of soil cover. Again, so if you have a lot of cover on the ground, and this is talking in tonnes per hectare, up to 1.1 tonnes per hectare of ground cover, you get no runoff. Obviously with no ground cover, you lose nearly half your water in runoff. So again, not so crucial up here, but it's very crucial there in drier areas of the country and drier areas of the world. And community dynamics, improving community dynamics. This guy chap called André Voisin, who many of you will have heard of. He was a scientist in the 50s and 60s. He wrote a book called Grass Productivity. And I found something similar when I was in America, in Mississippi. I visited a guy called Dr. Alan Williams, and he had taken on some, it was like long-term set-aside. They called it CRP land. And it was land that had been effectively set aside for 30 years, and it had grown up. The trees had grown up, had nothing done to it for 30 years. He came and took it and decided to farm it. And so to farm it, he got 2 bulldozers with a chain, and he just drove along and flattened all the trees, then pulled them out, and then he fenced it and turned cattle into it. And he said in the first year, it was fascinating. In the first year, he got loads of annual plants growing, and it would be the equivalent of our ragworts and our mare's tail, and anything that sort of colonises very quickly. So he said in the first year it was all weeds, annual weeds. Just the nature just wanted to get something growing. So he mob grazed through that, and the cattle trampled the load and ate some of it. And he said in year 2 he started to see some grasses coming through, and by year 3 it was almost all grasses. It was incredible. It was just from the natural seed bank, and this wasn't stuff that was brought in, and there were no grasslands. It was still surrounded by woodland all around, but he just saw grasses coming in from the seed bank. So these seeds had sat in the ground for 30 years. So I think it's important to remember that there's a huge seed bank in the soil, and if we give it the chance to express itself, it will do. Insects and pollinators. You see more and more insects as you get different species, and especially if you've got flowering plants like chicories or lucernes or samphoin, you'll start to see lots of insects and pollinators. We see lots of moths. So when you're walking through long grass, you see a lot of moths and butterflies. Soil inhabitants are less noticeable, but again, if you're pumping organic matter into the soil, you're going to be improving the soil inhabitants, because they're the ones that break down the organic matter. So if your organic matter is breaking down quickly, it's a sign that you've got a healthy soil and you've got lots of soil inhabitants. And other wildlife. So if you improve things in the soil, you're providing a food source for the very small birds and mammals, and it goes up the food chain. So you're helping the whole food web. So that's why you do it. The final part is, are we still all right for time? I've lost track of where we are. The clock doesn't work. Okay, perfect. So the final part is, how do you mob graze? What's the actual mechanism of getting started? So how do you go about it? The first thing, well, there's several things you've got to think about. The first is sort of actually planning the grazing and working out where the cattle should go to and how you manage them in terms of moving them each day. You've got to think about the fencing, the practicalities of fencing them. How are you going to keep them on the spot you want to graze them on? Where are they going to go to the following day, the following month? How are you going to get water to them? And I think water for a lot of farms is the most difficult. It's the most challenging thing. Unless you're blessed with the main supply, then getting enough water to the cattle is a real challenge. Choice of forage plants. Are you going to go with what you've got at the moment, or are you going to put in new Leys? And if so, then what are you going to put in? And finally, breeds of animal. What animal suits the system best? So here's an example of planned grazing. This is the block at East Hall Farm at St Paul's Walden Estate that I look after. This was all stewardship land, so this was all arable originally. and we put put it down to grass in 2012. So it's been mob grazed since 2012. And it's the fields with the red outline are the grazing fields. The rest is woodlands and gardens and different things. The first year we grazed it, we thought, well, this is easy. We'll just put fences along, divide it up with fences, and work our way around it. And so that's what we did. And at the end of a month or 6 weeks, we got to the end of the field, and then thought, well, where do we go from here? And we couldn't get the cattle. There's nowhere else for the cattle to go to. We hadn't really thought about how we were going to graze them, and we ended up having to drive them all the way back over regrowth and try. This was 102 cows with young calves at foot and half a dozen bulls, or 4 bulls at the time, trying to drive them over regrowth. It took nearly a day to get them back to the rest of the grazing, which is over in the east. So the following year, we divided it up with an electric fence down the middle. So we just put a temporary fence down the middle, and that allowed us to take the cattle round one side of the electric fence and then back the other. And so we didn't have to drive the cattle anywhere. By just giving it a little bit of thought and by just planning the grazing, we ended up, our last day of grazing, they were by the gate that we needed to get them out of to move them into the next block. So planning the grazing is quite important, and just thinking about the logistics of moving them and where you want to end up, where you want them to end up at the end of the day. I won't expect you to see the detail on this, and it's not a completed one, but this is there are planned grazing charts on the internet. It's more linked to holistic planned grazing, which is a thing run by Alan Savory, you may have heard of. He's the guru from South Africa who's really strong on, he doesn't like calling it mob grazing, he's actually on to the next level, which is holistically planned grazing. And he uses grazing charts like this, and these are brilliant. If you can get your head around these, and if you read Alan Savory's books, these are brilliant for planning your grazing, and it allows you to put in areas where you don't want the cattle to be, areas where you want the cattle to be at certain times of the year, and then you plot the grazing and which fields they're in over the course of the year. And I'll give an example of how it worked for us. Going back to the fields I showed you earlier, actually, soon after they'd been replanted, because we're on very flinty land, we've got a lot of flints in our soil, and because we'd ploughed and cultivated it to establish the grassland, we had a lot of flints on the surface, and we turned the bulls in when the cattle were on those fields on the first year, and we ended up with 3 or 4 of the bulls going lame, and we think it was because they landed on the flints and they just damaged their feet on the flints, and it was extremely hard on the bulls. So the following year we planned the grazing, and when we were planning the grazing, we just blocked out that area that we didn't want the cattle in those fields at that time of the year. So we have the field names down this side and the dates along the side, and we just blocked out that field for the months of when the bulls go in, from the middle of June through to the beginning of September, and we made sure the cattle weren't in those fields, and we planned the grazing around it. And it's that kind of thing you can do. You can plan to avoid bird nesting sites, or a site where there are orchids coming through in the spring. So planning the grazing like this with the chart is a really powerful tool, and I'd highly recommend it. Maybe not initially, just getting on the ground and doing the mob grazing initially, but as you get more into it, then using the grazing charts is extremely important. Fencing wise, it's relatively simple. You basically just like strip grazing. So if anyone's done strip grazing, it's very similar to strip grazing. The only possible difference, well, the main difference between this and strip grazing obviously is the recovery period. So you're not back to the same bit of land. It's also it's important that you don't bite the grass as it regrows, as I've said. So you want to avoid biting the grass as it regrows. So make sure you have a back fence in, so 3 or 4 days behind the cattle, so you don't have to have it in every day. You don't have to move your back fence, but I will put one in, move the cattle up, and after 3 or 4 days I'll move the back fence up again. So you don't need to move the back fence every day. You also don't need to worry about the back fence being too cattle proof. It's there as a barrier. They tend not to want to go back to old grazing if they don't realise it's regrowing and it's tasty. So as long as you've got a bit of a wire strung, you don't need to sort of go to the length and make it as secure as the one that's in front of the cattle. They'll always want to go towards the fresher grazing. So have a back fence. On this example, and this is what we've done at East Hall, we've got a hot wire. So we've got a permanent hot wire, which is the thick red line, which carries the charge, and we then just hook our laterals over the hot wire. I think I've got a picture later on. So that's the reel that we use. We use reels with a hook on. The one on the right, we hook the wire, we loop the wire over the hook, and then we hook the reel on the hot wire, and that then makes the whole of the temporary lateral live. And as soon as you lift it off, it's not live, and you can thread it through posts or reel it up or do whatever. So it's a very simple way of making the wire live. So we have the hot wire running either along the boundary of the field, or sometimes we've run it through the middle of the field and we divide it into two. But having this hot wire makes the job very quick. You can just draw your laterals out and hook them on, and it's live. And then you again on this diagram, it's a very diagrammatic, but I've shown that the first strip, especially early in the season, the first strip is probably going to be a lot larger than it will be later on in the season. So as the season goes on and as the days go on, you get a smaller and smaller strip. Because if you think about it, if you're turning out in early April, there'll be hardly any grass growth. Certainly it might be early May down here for you, up here for you guys, but certainly with us, early April will turn out. There won't be a lot of grass. We might have to give the cows 3, 4, 5 acres at a time. But then as the grass starts to grow, we'll reduce that until they could be on an acre, acre and a half a day. So it's sort of flexing the system according to how much grass you need to put to the cattle. And it's surprising how quickly you start to be able to work out how much the cattle need and how much area you need to give them. And occasionally you'll get it wrong, and you'll go back the next day and you'll think they've just eaten a bit too much grass, or they're a bit hungry, or you've left too much behind. But that's learning, and it's amazing how quickly you do get to grips with it. The water and the fencing, this is how we overcome it. This is one of our hot wires that runs down. It's effectively the middle of the field. I know there's a hedge there, but that's only it's a broken hedge. There's just patches of it. So it's a large field, and we run the wire down the middle of the trough, and we've got 4 or 5 of these troughs down the field, and we'll run the hot wire down the middle, and the cattle can then access the trough from both sides. And we will also put a laneway up to it. So if we're starting at the top end of the field and there isn't a trough until further down the field, we'll put a laneway down one side so the cattle can reach the trough. And then as the laterals work down, the laneway will disappear, and then we'll also go beyond the trough for 3 or 4 days, because our back fence won't be beyond the trough. So they can access one trough for 8 or 10 days, and 6 to 10 days on that system. And then by that stage they'll be close enough to the next trough to reach that one. So that's how we work the water. I've talked about the fencing and the reels. The big issue with water is obviously getting water to them in sufficient quantities. Now it's fine, as I said earlier, if you've got mains water, brilliant. Otherwise you have to find some way of getting water to them. And I've used all of these systems. Water bowsers, if you've got a big enough water bowser and you can get it there, that will work. It's not ideal, but it means filling it up every few days. It's quite labour intensive. It depends on the number of cattle as to how often you need to run it and the size of your bowser. Temporary overground pipes works better, in my opinion. So I've laid quite a lot of temporary overground pipes, 20 or 25 mil pipes, and I've run them over sort of 700, 800, 900 metres to fill up troughs. And in fact, the ones we saw, the black troughs earlier, they're just fed with overground pipes. One of the issues people say is that sunlight will perish them. We've not found that. This is with blue alkathene, and we've actually found that after a year or two, the pipes are semi-buried anyway. So you'll find that sort of worm action and vegetation growing over them will semi-bury the pipes anyway, so they don't suffer from sort of sunlight erosion. I've also used a water pump and a temporary trough, which is okay for small numbers of cattle. This was only a small pump and it was just doing a few cattle. Obviously for larger cattle it's more difficult. You can use ram pumps, and I know Andrew and Robert I was talking to earlier using a ram pump, which is another option. But it's challenging, and the size of the trough you need depends on the number of cattle. Here's another example of how we've made it work. We have a spring gate here, so the cattle are grazing one side of the field. We then move the spring gate to the other side, and they graze they can access the water from the other side. Forage plants, what works best? Well, I've mentioned cattle health and I've mentioned variety. I think the more you can get in the mix, the better. And one of the things that I was taught in North America is that having a mixture of not only broadleaves and grasses, but also the cool season and the warm season. So this is, if you remember again from your sort of probably college days, the C3 photosynthesizing and the C4 photosynthesizing plants, so the cool season and warm season. The C4 photosynthesizing plants tend to produce more energy and lower in protein, but they will grow in hotter periods. So if you get very warm periods, they outperform the cool season grasses and broadleaves. Obviously, the cool season, as the name suggests, will start growing earlier in the season. They have higher protein levels. They'll keep going later in the autumn as well. But a mix of the four, from a cattle health point of view and from a soil health point of view, these have been proven to be the optimum. So if you can get a mixture of all four in there, then all for the good. But regardless of whether you can and whether you can't, just more varieties the better. And if you think about it, not only from cattle health, but from a rooting point of view, so different plants will have different rooting depths. So you'll have, a chicory or a lucerne will put a root down a lot deeper than a ryegrass would, which stays very close to the surface. This is, I hope you can see them in detail. These are 4 photographs I took on the same day in the same field, that just showing the different treatments. So the one top left was pre-grazing, so that was just in front of the cattle. So I took that photograph. So this is a mixture of mainly lucerne and chicory in there, and cocksfoot and timothy grasses. I then took a photograph of it during grazing, and you can see they're starting to chew it down. There's dung in there. They're starting to trample it. Bottom right is post-grazing, so this is just a day or two post-grazing, and you can see a lot of trampled forage on the surface. The soil is protected. It's being kept cool underneath the trampled forage. Any rain that falls won't evaporate away straight off because of the trampled forage. And then a bit further up the field, we've got the regrowth. So I just literally walked along the field to where the cattle were. So before them, during grazing, post-grazing, and then right at where they started in the regrowth. And we can see how the plants are starting to regrow. You can see the trampled forage has disappeared, so that's starting to be hidden by the regrowth, starting to break down and grow into the soil. So I like this slide because it shows what we're trying to achieve when we're grazing. Seed choice for new Leys. At the moment, it seems to be a bit finger in the wind as to what you put into a mixture. I'm happy to try anything really. Some things in some fields, some things grow, and in other fields, other things grow. But if they're in there, they've got a chance of performing. The problem is the cost of the seed. So if you're going to put in herbal Leys rather than say for a straight ryegrass or a ryegrass clover mix, then you've got to keep it in for, in my opinion, 4 or 5 years to justify the cost of the seed. So if you're in an arable rotation, you're putting in herbal Leys, you've got to make sure you get your money's worth, because there's quite a lot of seed cost goes into the herbal Leys. But yeah, as I say, I'd be interested to get these guys' thoughts on seed mixtures. Just a quick mention on new Leys about wet weather, and you can see this is a field. This was grazed 2 years ago now. They were turned into this field just before a wet weekend. It poured with rain, and as you can see, they've trampled it, and it looks quite a mess. But the point is that number of cattle on there, if they were on there for a long period of time, they would have wrecked that sward. As it was, they were only on there for a day. They came off, they moved on to the next section, and as you can see, they just favour the next section. They don't go on to the first one at all. That incredibly recovered within a few days. Another shower of rain washed the mud off the leaves, and it transformed it, and it grew up, and you wouldn't have known anything was wrong with it. But from a conventional farmer's eye point of view, you'd look at that and think it was a disaster. So just be conscious that if you do try mob grazing and it turns wet, try and give the cattle a bigger area and try and move them on to a new block of land, but don't worry too much about the damage over a short period. If they're only on there for a short period of time, it isn't as half as bad as it looks. I'd caveat that, and this is from experience. When we first started establishing new Leys, we used plough-based system. We ploughed, we cultivated, we produced a beautiful seed bed. We got a lovely growth of seed. But what we had done by doing a plough-based system is we'd completely lost the soil structure. And so the first wet day that the cattle were on there, they completely ruined not only the sward, but ruined the soil itself. And for the next 4 or 5 years, we were battling weeds in there. We were battling docks and thistles because we'd ruined the soil, ruined the sward. We now, to establish it, we just tickle the surface of the soil. This is coming out of arable. We tickle the surface of the soil with a cultivator, and it literally is trying to do the top ½ inch, just enough to produce a fine tilth, but really as little as possible. We then broadcast the seed on, and we roll it in. And so we try and keep as much soil structure as we can, and we found that actually works much better. And we get a good establishment, but we also keep the structure, and it holds cattle much better in wet periods. So that's what we've learned. Finally, breeds of animal. It's a completely personal preference. I'm not going to debate what's better and what's worse. I know people who are doing native breeds. We run Sussex cattle, which are a nice native breed, but I know people running continentals equally successfully. I think it's all about room and capacity. So you've got to have an animal that can take in a lot of forage if it's going to be asked to perform on forage. It's got to have a certain amount of hardiness, because one of the things I haven't mentioned is that mob grazing can extend the grazing either end of the season, especially into the autumn. But it is down to personal preference. So yeah, breed I don't think matters as much as some people say, but it matters to a degree. That's it, I think. Feed the soil and the soil will feed you. Okay.